and welcome to this event, which is hosted by the Francis Crick Institute. And hello to people joining us online as well. There are as many people as this and a lot more online as well, I believe. And I'm not surprised on a rainy evening like this, but thank you for those of you who came out in this lovely weather to come here as well. I'm Claudia Hammond, and I'm the presenter of Health Check and The Evidence on the BBC World Service, which are both global health programmes, and also All in the Mind on BBC Radio 4. And it's lovely to be here again for World Immunology Day. This is something we've been doing every year for the last few years, and it's always sure to be a fascinating discussion. And today we are looking at allergies. And the chances are, I don't know, the last time you went to a restaurant, you were probably asked whether you had any allergies or not. And it feels as though there are a lot more of them around these days, but we'll be hearing about the evidence about that and what there is more of, what there might not be more of, and where allergies come from and what to do about them. And so, as I said, this event is to celebrate the International Day of Immunology 2023. And today's event is a joint event between Crick, Nature Research and the British Society for Immunology. So I'm just going to fill you in on what they do. So the Francis Crick Institute, where we are right now, is a biomedical discovery institute, and it researches the biology underlying human health. And so above us up here and below us, there are floors and floors of scientists working away, trying to understand why it is that disease develops, and then trying to really put that research into action to translate those discoveries into ways of preventing disease in the first place, from diagnosing it, hopefully diagnosing things earlier, and being able to treat those illnesses as well. And there's lots that the public can get involved with here too at Crick as well, in person, online, in schools, etc., all sorts going on. Nature, if you're someone who's in the scientific world, I'm sure you'll have heard of, is one of the leading science journals in the world, and they have various different journals. And you've probably heard Nature referred to in the news because it is the place where a lot of groundbreaking research gets published. And the British Society for Immunology represents scientists and clinicians who are studying the immune system in health and disease. And this is all about people, after all. So one of the things that is key to them is public engagement and understanding with these sorts of issues. And so they're also supporting this event tonight. And what we want to know today is how come some people find that their bodies react to things that are harmless to most other people, like, say, pollen or peanuts or cat fur or bee stings. You know, why is it that their body is in a sense turning against itself and reacting in one particular way that can be at a minimum irritating, and of course at the other extreme fatal, which can of course make life very stressful for those people who know they're living with a life-threatening allergy. So what's going to happen this evening is that after a short talk on some of the basics, my lovely panel here will introduce themselves, and we have some, amazing people on our panel, all amazing people on our panel, who really know what they're talking about in this area. And so there's going to be two separate opportunities for you to ask questions, whether you're in the room or at home. One halfway through on what we've heard so far, and one near the end. If you are online, then do put those in the Q&A. If you are here, then I'll get people to put their hands up, and there will be people with roving mics who will come to you. And as I said, we have some of the best experts on allergy here with us, so do be thinking what you'd like to ask. But first of all, I would like to introduce Paul Turner here, who is Reader in Paediatric Allergy and Clinical Immunology in the Faculty of Medicine at the National Heart and Lung Institute at Imperial College London. And he's going to give us a short talk on how allergies come about. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Claudia, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and a delight to somehow in 10 minutes tell you everything you ever wanted to know but didn't dare ask about allergies. It's a bit of a tall order, and I'm going to try not to make too many puns during this brief talk. This is just some of the words that have come up from a word cloud that has been undertaken to think about what people mean or consider or think about in terms of allergies and allergic disease. And you can see there's certain themes there: food allergies, there's some symptoms, hay fever, breathing, skin, and it's a really big topic. And one of the interesting things about allergy is that it's very unusual for people just to have a single allergy. Normally people, I don't know how many people in this room or online do have allergies, but chances are that you're looking at not just one word and going, that's me, but you're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, maybe even 20 words up there and going, that's me or that's my child or something. And because it's World Immunology Day, I was told I have to give you some immunology, but I don't want to get this overcomplicated. And essentially, when we think about immunology and allergy, we're still only beginning to crack the very outside of the knowledge of the nut. You've got to count the number of puns I try to slip in. And essentially, for basic allergy, there are those reactions that as soon as you get exposed to what you're allergic to, whether it's pollen or peanut, within minutes often something happens, and those are what we call immediate allergic reactions. And if you understand this, great. If not, don't worry about it. But then sometimes there's a build-up where things are silent. You have the exposure to the allergen, the thing that you're allergic to, and it can take hours, maybe even days, for symptoms beginning to show. And there's certain allergic diseases that can cause immediate reactions, and peanut allergy is one that everyone knows about. We're about to hit hay fever season properly in the UK. That's another. But then there's these delayed reactions that are a bit more insidious, and you might only get a diagnosis years after the process actually started. And so maybe that's something we'll touch on later. The crucial bit is that there are two stages here. There's an initial stage which we call sensitization. So the first time your body is exposed to the allergen, nothing happens because you have to become allergic first. Your body has to go through the immune changes so that then next time, the second time round, you react. Now, in some people, you can go through your entire life, so multiple exposures and nothing happens. And then all of a sudden in your 30s, you become allergic to something. And so sometimes this can take a very long time. And for years and decades, you don't become sensitized. And then all of a sudden, 30 or 40 years later, something twigs. So again, what causes that? Now, there's this recognition that in some way, allergies are a massive issue. And the last thing I want to do is try and turn around and say, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's not a problem. You don't need any money for clinical treatment or for research. Go home, everyone. Sorry to brought you out here tonight. This very small map is the latest data in terms of how prevalent wheezing, so asthma, in adolescents, an actual diagnosis of asthma ever in teenagers, eczema ever in teenagers, hay fever ever in teenagers. And I'm sorry it's so small, but each little symbol is a hospital or research site where we have relatively good data. And so if it's like a red star, you can go, oh, that's quite high, 1 in 5 people or more. If it's blue, you go, oh, that's less than 1 in 20. But you'll see in those countries where we've got data, there are lots of yellows and reds. So we're looking at 10 to 20% of people with an allergy, if not even higher than that. But when we think about how's that changed over time, and again, what I've tried to do here is just bring the latest data. Don't worry about all the countries or the towns and cities. These are just, each color line is a hospital or research setting where they've repeated 2, 3, or 4 times over the last 20, 30 years, how many people have asthma, how many people have eczema. And you can see that it's not that. We do not have lines going up, 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 up across the board. Most of the lines are actually fairly steady. And so I'm going to be here to try and argue that, yes, our grandparents didn't have food allergies, but actually we've probably hit the top of the epidemic, if there was ever an epidemic, and actually things are getting better. And I think that's a really important message to get out, because people are super anxious about allergies, whether it's asthma or food allergy, or even things like hay fever and eczema that people think, oh, don't really bother you that much. I mean, they're not going to kill you. But we know if you're a student sitting exams, and for some reason, in the Northern Hemisphere, we always do exams in the middle of the pollen season. And in the Southern Hemisphere, where I trained in Australia, we always do exams in the middle of the pollen season there. Whereas most people, when they do exams, if they get a B in their mocks, they'll get an A in a final thing. You'll go up a grade. People with uncontrolled allergies, whether it's eczema or hay fever or asthma, they drop a grade. So this has a massive impact on people's future careers, their livelihoods, and so on. That's why it's so important. And yes, there are data showing that severe allergic reactions are getting worse in the UK, but it's really important to understand how we do that data, how that data is obtained. And there's a lot of confusion between food allergy, which involves the immune system, and that's what we're going to focus on in terms of food today, and what we call, or used to call, food intolerance, things like lactose intolerance and so on, which is non-allergic. It doesn't involve the immune system. And while this stuff causes troublesome symptoms, bothersome symptoms, tummy pain, cramps, diarrhea, it's not nice, it's not going to kill you. This sort of stuff can kill you, and that's why usually we're focused much more on that. And importantly, it's not an on-off thing. So you don't have asthma or not. You have asthma symptoms that might start off mild or end up potentially being very severe. Likewise with food allergy, we have mild symptoms when people are exposed. That can be serious reactions, what we call anaphylaxis, but then most anaphylaxis isn't really life-threatening, but sometimes it is. And I had a kid yesterday who I fed peanut to, and they spent the night in intensive care on an adrenaline infusion because they are one of the few people who react really terribly to peanut. And one of the biggest issues we have is that we just can't tell who are those people out there who are at risk of the really bad reactions. And so while hospital admissions are going up in the UK over the last 10 years or so, actually, if you don't know how to look at the data, you can get a false idea, because this blue line includes people coming to all the hospitals in the UK for day case investigations, so to have allergy tests done. And when we say severe allergic reactions, we're not very good in the NHS at coding. This reaction was bad, this reaction wasn't so bad. So it's really hard to get a really good idea of what's going on. And you'll see here that the red line is when we took the same data and analysed it for whether it was coded correctly or not, as far as we could tell. And you can see it's not quite as bad as the headlines point out. Even more so, they're not great ways of working out how many people have allergies. And so we have to come up with loopholes and so on to try and get good data. And you'll see that if we look at just how many people come into hospital, well, over the last 20 years, it's gone up, and it's gone up in all age groups, particularly children. But if we look at how good we are as a country at preventing people from dying from food allergy, it's actually gone down. This is good news for people with food allergy. And we've got to get the balance right between allergies getting more, please give us money for research and to give better care. And actually, we're getting better at our jobs and protecting people and looking after people with allergies. So while it's going up and a lot more people have allergies now, on the other hand, you don't need to be more scared. We are getting better at looking after you. And this is just the latest data we've been looking at using national GP data in the UK. And you can see that the prevalence, for instance, of food allergy is going up. So this dark blue line is food hypersensitivity, gone from 1% in 2008 to around 2% in 10 years later. If we try to drill down to people who perhaps are at risk of anaphylaxis, actually that's a very pale blue line. It's not so bad, 0 to 0.5%. It's still quite high, and there's an increase. But the good news again is if we look at the incidence, so this is the number of new cases in any one year, you'll see that these lines are straight. So if you imagine you've got a bucket, and every year you're adding, let's say, a cup of water into the bucket. That bucket's getting bigger, more people have allergies, but every single year it's still only a cup. It's not a cup one year, then 2 cups the next year, 4 cups and so on. So the reason there are more people with allergies now is simply because we've got the same number of new diagnoses every single year. And so we did think about, there are allergy epidemics in particular for food allergy, and certainly there's some data that we had this 20 years ago, and we were trying to work out why. Is it due to something called the allergic march? And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Is it because we're more careful with, how we wash our hands and hygiene these days? It's very hard to buy washing up liquid or soap that doesn't kill 99.9% of bugs. Actually, soap's pretty good alone without any antibacterials at killing 99.9% of bugs. But there you go. Is it because we're living in a more pro-allergic state, whether that's pollution or what we eat or how we eat? Is there somehow this thing that if you have allergies, you pass on a genetic tendency for your children to have more allergies, and then they pass it on, And it's a bit like a domino effect. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We don't know, and maybe you want to ask us about that. And certainly there have been big rises in hay fever and asthma, but those increases, as you can see, happened over 100 years ago. This is not something new. We've ridden the epidemics already. And there are lots of things that have changed over that time. You know, we're using more antibiotics. We tend to use different drugs than what we did 100 years ago. Vaccination has changed. We tend to play outside less. We tend to play more watching a computer screen and less interaction, less exposure to other people and other germs and so on. So potentially all these things might have contributed to what's happened 100 years ago. And now maybe there's an epidemic in peanut allergy, and there's certain new allergies that are coming on that, again, maybe we'll touch on tonight. But actually, it's not entirely clear. And the UK data shows that we've got the same amount of peanut allergy now as we had 20 to 25 years ago. And lots of other countries are like that as well. So we've plateaued out. It's not getting worse. And we'll maybe touch on why we had this increase in food allergy, and in particular, something known as the dual hit hypothesis. The idea here is that we're meant to eat peanut, and children who eat peanut actually learn how to deal with it. They become tolerant to peanut as such. But if you don't eat peanut, but you're exposed to it because it's in the household, it's in the dust, it's in creams and everything else, and you have skin problems like eczema, the peanut gets into the body through the skin instead of through the mouth. And maybe that's what drives this allergic response. And so a lot of the work we do now is about how to try to correct that. How can we think about fixing the skin and instead encouraging kids to eat peanut by mouth so that their bodies learn how to treat it like a food, like peanut, and not like nuclear war. And there's some very famous studies that you might have heard of, the LEAP study in one in particular in this country, where we have shown doing this works, introducing peanut early works, particularly in people with skin problems. So maybe this can help make peanut allergy go away. But at the same time, this study was recently published in Australia, where the national guidelines encourage people to eat more peanut, especially if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, or you're a toddler or a baby eating solids, and your family, your parents should give you more peanut. And interestingly, they found it didn't change how many people in Australia in this very large city-based birth cohort had peanut allergy. So we need to think about what's happened there. The last thing I want to touch on is something known as the atopic march, and you may well have heard about this, atopic march or the allergic march. And it's this idea that when we're sitting in our clinics, people who are babies, well, they'll come initially with eczema, and then they seem to get food allergy. And then if they're at this age, well, they're getting asthma. And then when they get near teenagers and doing exams, they get hay fever. And the idea of, well, maybe eczema leads to food allergy, which leads to asthma, which leads to hay fever. This idea of one allergic thing creating another allergic thing. And there's loads of papers and publications still saying, yes, this is exactly what's going on. But this is why we need data and research and evidence. So if you look at this graph here, red line is eczema. So you can see that there are some people who start off at very young age 1 or even younger, with eczema. And they then develop asthma, the blue line, and then they develop hay fever, rhinitis, the green line. This is the atopic march, the allergic march. But there are lots of other patterns of how people come on with allergies as well. Just look at the differences between those graphs. That's the allergic march, and only 3% in this huge data set of tens of thousands of children followed this eczema, food allergy, asthma, rhinitis. So the majority of children don't follow the rules. They haven't read this textbook. And so a lot of us don't believe the atopic march exists. So what are the take-home points in my 12 minutes I think I'm at? Allergy involves the immune system. Food intolerance doesn't. And we have to be really clear about that. There is no evidence for food allergy in the last epidemic in the last 20 years in this country, nor in many other countries. There has been an increase. It happened 20 to 30 years ago. We're now steady. And the last question, which maybe we want to think about tonight, does a topic march really exist? And that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was a very impressive whistle-stop tour there. You fitted an enormous amount in, and I'm sure we will discuss lots of those things as well. I want to get my other members of the panel to introduce themselves as well. So, Clare, Lloyd, can you tell us what you do and what your work is as an allergist? Yes, it is.
Hi, I'm Clare Lloyd. I'm a respiratory immunologist from the National Heart and Lung Institute, so the same department as Paul at Imperial College. And I'm a basic scientist, and I'm really interested in how the immune system in the lungs deals with what we breathe in every day. So all of the pollens, allergens, and as well as pathogens, so viruses and bacteria, and how that in some people ends up as wheezing and asthma. And we're really interested in what happens across the life course. So we study infants, children, and then how the asthma changes as they grow up.
Thank you. And over here we have Alexandra Santos. Can you tell us what you do?
Thank you. So my name is Alexandra Santos, and I'm a pediatric allergist by training. So I'm a medical doctor. I specialize in allergy, in children's allergies, and I see children with all sorts of allergic diseases once a week. And then I dedicate the rest of my time to research, and my research is on food allergy. And so we are interested in, on one hand, improve the way we diagnose food allergies. So trying to get better tests that can be more precise than the ones we currently have, and reduce the number of oral food challenges we have to do, which involve giving the food, suspected food by mouth in the hospital ward and monitoring for allergic reactions. And then the other thing we are interested in is to explore and understand better the way the immune system responds to food allergens in allergic and intolerant children, to try to identify new targets for a definitive treatment of food allergy that we currently do not have.
And Carsten, Flohr.
Hello, nice to meet you all. I'm a consultant dermatologist at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, St John's Institute of Dermatology, which is Europe's largest clinical and research center for skin conditions. Like Alex, I'm a clinical academic, and so do a once-a-week clinic for children and young adults with severe atopic eczema. They are the sort of patients who need oral tablet treatments or injectable treatments, biologics and small molecules we might be touching on later. I spent 3 years of my life in Vietnam. In 2004, 2007, took my family there, and my research as a PhD to understand why children in Saigon have a lot of asthma and a lot of eczema, but in the countryside, not very far away, just 50, 100 kilometers away, people who have a very similar genetic background have no asthma and no hay fever. So along the lines of the hygiene hypothesis, something we might touch on later. So I'm still very much interested in environmental risk factors. Part of my team, we're now looking at early life risk factors that are environmental. There is a story around water hardness, for instance, and whether installing water hardness, water softness in early life, even before birth, might prevent eczema. We're interested in the bacteria on the skin and in the gut, and how that links in with the development of eczema, how it might drive disease flares as well. We have ongoing work with Alex along the lines of what Paul was talking about, how people become allergic to foods through the skin, especially if it's inflamed in early life, and what we can do about preventing that. And then we have a lot of adolescents with anxiety and depression, especially those with very severe eczema. So we're trying to understand how the mind and the skin work together. There's a very close link there, and sort of a program of work around that as well.
Yeah, so a whole range of work that's being done there. So Clare, you were saying that you do some of the basic science on this. So can you tell us what is happening in the body? What is an allergic response? What happens?
So it's a very specific immune response. So it involves the parts of the immune system which can go along a particular path. So when we're looking at either blood or samples from either a skin biopsy or when we look in the lungs, we can see a very particular pattern of cells that are recruited to that site of inflammation. And so these are T cells, but they have a very specific secretion of particular proteins. And then cells called eosinophils, and they think those are ones that are contributed to damage, but they're very specific to an allergic reaction, along with other cells like Alex mentioned, so basophils and mast cells. And then in the blood, we can also see, in some patients, we can also see those cells. And as Paul mentioned, when we look at proteins in the blood, we can see things like immunoglobulin. And in an allergic reaction, it's a very specific type of immunoglobulin, that's immunoglobulin E, and we can follow patients according to the levels of those proteins in those cells.
But is it the body turning against itself?
Yes. So, I mean, we always, our immune system is supposed to develop tolerance to innocuous proteins. And obviously, one would hope, for most of us in the room, one would hope that these proteins are innocuous, and that our immune system, particularly when we're breathing in, it knows which things to respond to. So in a healthy person, we'd hope that the immune system can look at what's being breathed in, and then, or is on your skin, or when you're ingesting, and you can see that, and would ignore for most of it, but actually is then poised to respond really quickly and efficiently to deal with bacteria and viruses which might cause disease.
And it's interesting, this thing that Paul was saying about how you can't be allergic to something the first time you encounter it. It's okay the first time. So even people who are really allergic to, I don't know, bee stings, it means the first time they were stung, it was okay.
Yeah. And so I think that's priming the immune system. And so I think that's something that we're all trying to understand, is when and how do people become sensitized. And I think you'll notice that we focus very often on children. And so my lab is really focusing on babies and infants, just to try and see, that we can't really diagnose them at asthma at very, very young times, but they will wheeze on exposure to things. So we want to understand how that then develops into asthma. So we don't really understand how people are sensitized as yet, and that's something that I think has become a focus of research more recently.
And Paul, you mentioned this difference between what's an allergy and what's an intolerance, and that is something people often get confused by, isn't it? And I know many a waiter who will say, the whole table tells them everything they're intolerant to, when actually what they really want to know, isn't it, is have we got to keep these foods completely separate in the kitchen because somebody might have a life-threatening allergic reaction?
Absolutely. I mean, where it plays out is, first of all, I remember I spent most of my life in school saying I'm allergic to lamb because I didn't like the taste of lamb. I love it now. God knows what was wrong with me back then. We bound these terms around, we throw them around. But what people don't understand, especially in food businesses, and we have to bear in mind that often it's the lowest paid staff who are often working behind the scenes, preparing the food that we all eat, that if it's just an intolerance, you're not going to die from it. Whereas if you've got a food allergy of some sort, or even if you've got celiac disease, where that's also associated with a risk of death if you have ongoing exposure to what you're sensitive to or allergic to, dare I say it. I hope we haven't got any gastroenterology doctors in the room. That also can cause lymphoma and death. And so these people are living with almost like a time bomb, except they don't know where the clock is, because they're completely fine. They don't know what's happening where their food is being prepared or something. And it could be they are the person who are going to be like the kid I had yesterday, who actually can have really, really severe, proper life-threatening reactions. And we don't know. We need Alex's diagnostics to help us work out, when I see someone in the clinic, do I really need to worry about you? Or actually, no, you're going to be okay. And so we've got to get the message out there. And likewise, within doctors and nurses, we have had, and recently there was a fatality where someone, this is like about 4 or 5 years ago, where someone who was milk allergic was told, it's okay, you can have lactose-free milk, which is what we use for people with milk intolerances. And lactose-free milk still contains milk protein, and that child actually died. And that wasn't a healthcare professional, it was a person who worked in alternative medicine. And that's not to say I'm against alternative medicine, but I think we really need to work hard at getting the message out there between intolerance and actual allergy.
Yeah, because these terms often in everyday conversation, they do get used, we use them really interchangeably. And presumably, Alex, with the families you work with, this must be enormously stressful to know, when parents are, say, trying to work out what a child might be exposed to when they, I don't know, go to someone else's house or something like that. It must be enormously stressful.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Anxiety is a big part of the burden of food allergy, of the disease, and I think we should be able to measure it better. So, being diagnosed with a food allergy has impact on, everyday life. We eat 4 or 5 times a day. There's a lot of concern from parents about what foods they're going to have at school, if they have a play date, if they have a birthday party, a school trip. All these, events that should be full of joy are actually full of worry, and sometimes these children actually don't go to these events either because they are too concerned, or their parents are too concerned, or other parents don't want to take the responsibility of taking them on as well. So, and teenagers can also be quite anxious, and young adults. So anxiety is a big part of living with a food allergy. And this is the reason why we have more than one full-time clinical psychologist as part of our own allergy service, just to be able to organize workshops and have one-to-one sessions with these children and these families. And I think we need to be better at measuring the impact that food allergies can have. As Paul said, the patients are well if they are not exposed to the allergen, but are they? Sometimes, if they are very anxious, they're actually living with this constant worry and constant concern about traveling and all these events. So they can restrict not only their diet, but also their social life, their family life, and it can have, a huge impact on very little things that we don't often think about.
And I guess other people's reactions can sometimes be difficult there as well. Like you mentioned, other parents might not want the responsibility of trying to deal with this, but they're not just being fussy, are they? This is so serious.
Yeah, absolutely. It's understandable. But it's very hard for the children as well. And when they reach, sort of school age, they start to understand how, this can have an impact on their friendships, on their, social life, essentially. And it can really restrict their experiences, and they live with this constant worry.
Now, Carsten, allergic reactions cause different symptoms for different organs, and you look at skin in particular. So what can happen to the skin? Are there a range of responses?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on what condition we're talking about. We start with eczema, so that is inflamed, red, very itchy. Scratching usually causes or can cause infection very often, oozing, crusting as a result, wet skin, and then lichenification it's called, so thickening of the skin, because people are day in, day out for many years scratching the skin, and the skin has enough and wants to protect itself, so it becomes like elephant skin. That's around eczema. If you're then allergic to environmental allergens like a house dust mite or tree and grass pollen during the pollen season, eczema very often flares, typically in those areas that are touched by the pollen, so the face, the neck, the hands. If you're allergic to foods, you eat the food, you're already allergic, then the eczema could flare. Chemical allergies are also important, especially in adults. So healthcare professionals, car mechanics, hairdressers are exposed to a lot of chemicals, so they tend to get hand eczema as a result. Very often if they've had eczema as a child and then grew out of it. And then urticaria, so itchy wheals, and what we call angioedema, swelling of the skin, you can have with acute allergic reactions as well, typically to foods.
Where's dermatitis fit into that? Is that just a word for anything?
Yes, that's anything. That's just a huge bag of a skin condition, if you like, maybe an inflamed skin condition, but not a very specific term.
Right, fair enough. And Claire, you look at the lungs in particular. What can happen to the lungs?
So then the lungs become inflamed, so that you have recruitment of these inflammatory cells who then release their toxins. And you commonly find that can cause irritation, so increase in coughing, increase in sort of mucus, so that then people can cough that up. And people feel a tightness in their chest because their airways become narrower, and so they struggle to breathe. And that, as they get anxious about that, then also that becomes worse. So I think, tightness of their chest and difficulty getting enough air into their lungs.
And then the gut, of course, Alex, what happens to the gut?
So there's a variety of symptoms that people can experience when they have gut symptoms. So things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. And this can be a manifestation of food allergy because they've ingested food, and it's a reaction of the immune system to the protein in food. But it can also be part of a systemic response, of anaphylaxis induced by another type of allergen.
And what do you make of this idea of sometimes allergies progressing from the skin, say, to the gut?
Yeah, during allergic reactions, especially if they are what we call systemic allergic reactions, so these are reactions that affect various organs and systems in our body, the symptoms can progress, for example, from tingling in the mouth or tingling in the palm of the hands towards hives all over the body or some swelling, difficulties in breathing and wheezing. So they can progress from one organ system to another.
And I thought it was really interesting, Paul, that one of the things that you were saying was that there hasn't been an increase in the last 20 years in food allergies, but that there was before that. So when was the big increase? Sort of 80s, 90s?
So it depends which country you look at. And one of the problems is that if you ask people, and we could do it in this room, who has a food allergy? I was actually going to ask, okay, if you want to. Now, if you do that in a very big public area, probably only 1 out of 10 people who put their hands up actually does have a food allergy when we test it in hospital. And so we've got this massive issue of, well, how do you define food allergy? And so when you look at how common, how many people have food allergy, do you do it by who has food allergy here? Or do you do it like, come in, I'm going to give you the thing you're allergic to or you think you're allergic to. Let's see if something happens. In America, they do these random phone surveys where you just phone you up and go, hi, you got a food allergy? Oh, okay, thanks, bye. And that's it. And that's how some of these data are based. And that's why we need a proper scientific approach. In the UK, we had a study done on the Isle of Wight. So the fantastic thing about the Isle of Wight, apart from it's beautiful when the weather's nice, is that it's quite a stable population. And so the NIHR, which is one part of the funding that research has in the UK, did over a sort of 15 to 20 year period, these 3 studies. Who in the Isle of Wight thinks they've got a food allergy? Come to our hospital, we'll test you, and then we'll see if it's true or not. And so it went from the sort of around 1988, 89, at around, I think it was about 0.6, 0.7%, to then around 5 to 7 years later, about 1.5%. This is for peanut allergy. But then, more recently, and this was probably about 10, 15 years ago, it's gone to 1.2%. And it's probably roughly the same now. I'm in touch with the colleagues there who are still doing these sort of work. And so if we did have it in the UK, it was probably around sort of late 1980s, early 1990s, we saw that increase. And now we're left with, as I say, the bucket's pretty full already, and there's a little bit more going in every single year, but it's the same amount every single year going in. And our challenge is, well, can we reduce the amount that's going in at the top, and can we drill a hole in the bottom?
Yeah. Well, let's take have some questions now from the audience on what we've covered so far. We are going to talk about treatment and prevention next afterwards. So don't ask questions about those if you don't mind. But does anyone have any questions on what they've heard so far, either here in the room or online? Do put your hand up, and please do wait for the mic to get right to you, or the people there won't be able to hear. Could you stick your hand up again so the person with the mic can see you? She's just there.
Hi, my grandson, who's 10, we think is going to be diagnosed with celiac disease next week. The blood test seems to suggest he has, but he's going to have a full thingy. Is that an allergy or not? I was very, very taken aback to hear you say that celiac can also react where it can be fatal.
Is celiac disease an allergy?
So I think I would consider it is, in terms of it's an immune response to a food allergen, but it overlaps with what we call autoimmune disease, that it exists because the body is making an antibody to that food, which it wouldn't normally make. And so there is this argument amongst gastroenterologists, is it immune hypersensitivity, which is what an allergy is, or is it an allergy? And they like some distance between those of us that do allergy and those of us that do gastro. Some of us do both. And so we sort of watch the battle and try and sort of stay in the middle on neutral territory. It's a really good question, so thank you for asking it, and thank you for giving me the chance to clarify. So the reason why with celiac disease, it's really important people have a gluten-free diet is because if they are eating gluten regularly, they will get often tummy aches, sometimes they don't. But if there's a buildup of the inflammation over time, and so if you are undiagnosed with celiac disease and you're having wheat and other gluten-containing grains, that increases your risk to lymphoma. And lymphoma can be fatal, although we're getting better at treating it. So the reason why industry and everyone needs to take celiac disease really seriously is because that build-up effect over time can predispose you to things that can kill you. That's different from food allergy, where you eat what you have and you've got a small chance you're going to have a really severe reaction that's going to get you there and then.
Yeah, so it's not some immediate thing, but again, it's why diagnosis and finding out how to do these
Is so
things for
important.
research matters. Yeah. Any other questions? Do put your hand up. Yes, we have one over here.
In relation to the stats for the United Kingdom, is there regional variations, social class variations, poverty variations? What does the stats tell us?
So again, the data is limited. In terms of hospital admissions, Wales is a bit of an outlier, but it looks like the reason for that is because lots of people live in Wales actually live closest to hospitals in England, and therefore that sort of plays tricks with the data. We're actually now looking at the same data I showed you to try and identify people who have a certain, come from more deprived areas, to see if they have either different rates and also to see if the management is different. So do they have different levels of access to NHS services if you live in one postcode rather than another postcode? And that's something that we're hoping to continue looking forward in the future. We know that sort of geographical differences as well as ethnic differences are a massive issue in some countries like the USA in terms of access to healthcare when it comes to asthma, when it comes to allergies, when it comes to eczema. And I'd be surprised if it wasn't the same in the UK as well.
Can I just quickly come in on the geographical differences? So eczema, there's quite a bit of variation across the country, which to a degree maps the water hardness distribution in the UK. So having high calcium carbonate levels in domestic water, London surrounding areas, big problem. If you're in the northwest or the southwest of the country, very soft water. And when there is a geographical map of eczema prevalence, it's all, it matches very closely. So that's a key environmental factor.
Where the water is hard.
Harder, exactly. Yes, yeah. Especially if you have a positive family history, something that we've shown as part of our research called gene-environment interaction. If you carry a gene that impairs your skin barrier in early life, you live in a hard water area, that's the highest risk for developing eczema.
If people move house, if people move to a soft water area, do they see a difference?
Yeah, and very often people say that, they go on holiday to a hard water area, their skin starts tingling, their skin becomes dry. If they move back if they live in a soft water area, things settle down again.
Fascinating. And there's questions coming in from online as well, and Zoltan here is going to give
yeah,
us one of those.
we've got a question from Isabel Davis online. They ask, why does exposure to potential allergens at a younger age mean that someone is more likely to be tolerant to it? So that developmental window. In this case, why do people develop allergies to things despite having been exposed to throughout their life?
Alex, is that one you can take?
Sure. So the immune system, I mean, we don't really know exactly what is different in the immune system, but the immune system in young children is more plastic, so it can change more easily to changes in the environment. And then it has to do as well with the route of exposure to the allergen. So for example, for foods, it is clear that the gastrointestinal, so the oral route and gastrointestinal immune system is prepared to tolerate, food, so foreign proteins that in foods or in microbes, for example, our gut is full of microbes and we are okay with that, we live happily with them. So this is the sort of healthy response. It's not the same when foods get exposed, exposed for the first time through the skin, for example, like Paul mentioned, or even through the airways. So it has to do with the route of exposure, the dose of exposure. But then in young children, the immune system is more plastic. So if the allergens get exposed through the right route, so to say, in the right dose and at the right time, we'll have tolerance. If the allergen gets exposed through other routes in a different dose, so for example, a high dose for foods, a high dose by mouth before the food gets exposed through other means will lead to tolerance. If there is an exposure through the skin or through the airways in a small dose before tolerance has happened through the gastrointestinal tract, then we have an allergy.
But Carsten, will you sometimes find that children grow out of their allergies?
They do sometimes, but if I come back to them in a moment, but there is an evolutionary story around this, and Paul is right. You know, we have now in the UK setting a plateau of allergies, and the rise happened a long time ago. So coming back to my story around Vietnam, where I spent 3 years, where there's huge lifestyle differences between cities and the countryside. So for instance, people are exposed to parasites because of poor hygiene in the countryside, and parasites are protective by and large. I'm talking about gut parasites, so hookworm, for instance. And you know, there's data, if you remove hookworm from pregnant mothers by giving tablets that kill the worms, you are going to have a population of children that will have more eczema downstream. Now, we used to have parasites in the UK as well, you know, 50, 60 years ago. Now our lifestyles are so similar, whether you live in a countryside in beautiful Shropshire, or whether you live in central London, people eat the same food. But I strongly suspect if you're going to map McDonald's restaurants across the world and look at allergy prevalence, wherever you've got a high density of McDonald's, you probably have, and that obviously is just a marker of lifestyle in the broader sense, a higher rate of allergy as well.
So it's not McDonald's fault. Yes, it's different. Yeah.
Kentucky Fried Chicken then.
Zoltan, have you got any others?
Yeah, got some more. This is a nice nerdy question in a good way. Could you talk a little bit about mast cell activation, what their role is, and how stress affects that? I guess the questioner is interested in how stress can actually contribute to activation of mast cells, which could then drive and worsen allergies.
Claire, that sounds like one for you. If you can tell us that straightforwardly as well.
Well, I think that we're as Carsten mentioned, we're sort of thinking about how stress and certainly the sort of nervous system really interact with the immune system. So some of the sort of neuropeptides that are produced during stress have been known to activate the type of cells that are involved in allergic reactions. So in specifically mast cells, they generally tend to be in the kind of lining of the airways or the gut. And once they're triggered and activated, then they secrete kind of toxic granules, which then damage the rest of the local sort of cells surrounding them, and that's what sort of generally causes the damage that's associated with it. And so I think that's something that we're looking at. There's obviously anxiety around having allergies, but then and so whether that contributes to the severity of them, that's something that we're sort of, I think, studying right now.
It always seems terribly unfair that at the moment when people are really stressed, it also all gets worse. It's as if they need that to add to their stresses as is. Were you going to say something, Paul?
I mean, it's very challenging. Sometimes when Alex and I do food challenges in hospital where we take children or adults and we give them peanuts very carefully and slowly, and where we really need to be very accurate with an answer, do you have allergy or not? We do dummy challenges sometimes. It's ethical, it's okay. Someone says it's okay, it all gets a sort of, it's all kosher. And occasionally people react with an allergic reaction when we're not giving them the thing they're allergic to. And there are two stories in the literature. It's old research. One I came across in the 1960s when I was doing some research ages ago in asthma. And there's this really horrible study, which would never get away with doing nowadays. But what they did, they took a whole bunch of people with asthma and they gave them a medicine to cause an asthma attack. And we do that sometimes in hospital. And then they gave them the blue puffer, which makes it better. For those people who have asthma and have friends, there's a blue puffer that we use and it opens up the airways. And they did a trick that they took the medicine out of the blue puffer and they popped it in the other puffer and said, this is going to cause you to get wheezy. And so these people were using their blue puffer, they didn't realize it was blue, and they got wheezy. And then they gave them the other medicine, which should have normally caused them to get wheezy, and lots of them got better. There's a massive placebo effect. And we see that as well, possibly in food allergy. The most interesting study in food allergy I've come across was sort of flagged to me by a colleague in America only very recently. And again, it's done in the 1970s in rats, so it's not as unethical as the one that was done in humans in the 1960s. And they basically had an animal model of allergen. They managed to make these rats allergic to egg. And when they would feed these animals, they would ring a bell, like Pavlov's dog type experiment. And then, after having created this sort of sensitization and these animals being allergic, they could then create allergic reactions by feeding them and there wasn't egg in the food that they were giving the animals, but just by ringing the bell, these animals would come down with allergic reactions. Are those rats mad? And I think there's a real lesson there, because, you know, we sometimes quickly dispel people with allergic symptoms. Oh, you're crazy, you're mad. But it's quite clear there really is this interaction between the brain, the placebo effect, and its ability to do something to mast cells, where all of a sudden mast cells are responding, reacting, and that can mimic an allergic reaction or make a proper allergic reaction worse. And there's some data to show that if you've got peanut allergy, if you're stressed, your reactions are worse than if you're not stressed.
And
So-
in those experiments, the ones of the people, it's not that they're deliberately kind of putting on their reaction. They are having the reaction, aren't they? Something physical is happening.
So it's not uncommon, although it happens about 1 in 50 reactions apparently, or placebo cases. That's what's reported, 1 in 50 to 1 in 100, where all of a sudden people come out in the urticaria that Carsten mentioned before, where there's sort of small swellings of the skin that are itchy. Now, either they're reacting to something in the hospital, and maybe some people are allergic to hospitals, or it's the context of the stress. Oh my God, I'm going to react to something. And that's bringing out this urticaria.
Wow, that's amazing. Are there any more questions from in here? Yes, somebody just here.
I was going to ask about the allergens themselves. So we quite often see, an uneven distribution, as you might say, between certain molecules that seem to cause a lot of allergies and other molecules that are all around us that almost never do. Is there something molecular about that, or is it to do with our biology?
Claire, what would you say? That's interesting.
Well, there's a huge range, and I think that there are loads of people who are actually studying the structure of allergens, and there isn't anything that kind of particularly, distinguishes, say, pollen from, and it's something that's non-allergenic. But when you look at, the commonest allergens, certainly for our asthmatic cohort, is house dust mite. That's something that is ubiquitous. It's in all of our soft furnishings, in your bed, no matter how clean you are. So we're constantly exposed to house dust mite, but only a proportion of people are actually allergic to it. But when you look at the chemical structure of house dust mite and compare it to, say, cat allergen or rabbit allergen, the other things that people are commonly allergic to, there's nothing that particularly sets it apart from other things that are non-allergenic. But I think that we're trying to understand the structure of those allergens to try and see if we can then develop reagents or drugs which make people tolerant to those particular allergens. And that's been particularly successful in actually ragweed. So things that's a pollen that causes rhinitis. It's very, very common. And so some of our colleagues have generated, or just by exposing people to sort of maybe slightly mutated forms of pollen, then you can actually trick the immune system to then to think actually you should be tolerant to this, and then dampen the symptoms.
Thank you. We will take some more questions later. But I want to move on a bit to why some individuals develop allergies and others don't. Carsten, do we have any idea why that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. But like with so many conditions, it's a combination of genetics and environment. And I'd say in all allergic diseases, the genetics is a small component, important but small. So, family history. I mean, if you use eczema as an example, imagine your skin being like a wall with bricks and mortar. The most important genetic risk factor for eczema is a mutation in a gene called filaggrin, which is a skin barrier gene. So about 40% of people with eczema, especially early onset, more severe eczema, have a mutation in the filaggrin gene. You have less mortar between your bricks of the wall of the skin. And then if environmental factors come on top, we've already discussed the water hardness story, for instance, they then will kickstart the inflammation, and then you're getting into an itching, scratching cycle that then drives the disease further. Environmental pollution is really important. It damages various parts of environmental pollution, damage the skin barrier, but also has a detrimental effect during pregnancy. And you mentioned, Paul, I think in one of your slides, epigenetic change. We know that during pregnancy, if there's heavy pollution exposure to the pregnant lady, that will shift the immune system of the developing fetus towards an allergic phenotype. And then there is this story, for instance, around Hammond parasites in developing countries. A lot of them in the countryside, very little in big cities. And these parasites are very clever. They fine-tune our immune system. If you've got them in your gut, they will prevent, at least to a degree, allergic inflammation as well developing. So it's very complicated in terms of the environmental factors, but they are the key, as well as in the background, the genetics as well.
Could you use those helminth parasites in some way, or would you not want to because you don't want the helminth?
You could. Now, so what happened was I was in Vietnam looking at whether removing parasites would cause children in Vietnam in the countryside where literally everybody had a hookworm infection or a worm infection called Ascaris. Removing the worms, does that cause the children to become wheezy, itchy, and sneezy? Well, it didn't, but it switched their immune system response. You mentioned skin prick testing. So when we tested them to house dust mite and cockroach, important allergens in that Vietnamese setting, they became more positive to those environmental allergens in this randomized controlled trial that I was running in the countryside over a year. While I was doing that, in Vietnam, a colleague of mine in Nottingham infected Nottingham people with asthma and with hay fever with hookworm. They're really clever beasts. If you put a little bit of wet gauze, hookworm larvae onto the skin, they're within your skin within a minute or so. How they do it, we don't quite know. They have enzymes that cleave the links between the skin cells. They then go into your lungs. They have two developmental stages there. They then crawl up your respiratory tract. You cough, they come up, you swallow, and that's how they end up in your gut. And if you're lucky, then you'll have your male and female, and you produce loads of eggs and so on. We try to do that. That's the Vietnamese scenario, to do that with asthmatics and hay fever people in Nottingham. The problem was that at very low doses, they started being symptomatic. They got tummy pains and diarrhea. And so we never reached the levels that people would have in a Vietnamese setting, where the children get recurrently infected again and again, and that immune balance develops. So we would have loved to do that, but that's where the limitations were. Everybody kept their worms though after the trial. They refused the worm tablets, and the person who was my PhD fellow in Nottingham kept the parasites. She still has them, I think, and she even kept them during her pregnancy because she had allergies, her children don't. So that's not a proof that works, but we couldn't do that in a UK setting.
So is that route not being looked at anymore then, because it would make people too ill?
I think the research has stopped. So Novartis, which is a big global sort of pharma player, had a program around isolating molecules from the saliva of hookworms as a treatment for allergic diseases, and they use beagle dogs. And I'm not sure why the program stopped, but it hasn't. I don't think it's progressed any further. You would have to infect ladies during pregnancy because this priming of the immune system is key, around that perinatal periods. And we also know, for instance, that farm animal contact during pregnancy is protective against allergies. It's what happens around, that precious time. And it's not just about one particular pathogen. I'm saying the worm story is everything. It's just one component, but it's the overall microbial exposure that seems to be the important thing.
And Claire, what else can we learn from the science and from the biology about how allergies might be able to be prevented?
I think I was going to bring that up because I think that one thing we do understand is it's trying to understand the immune system and how the immune system develops, both during pregnancy, so the fetus, and then immediately postnatal. So we know that once a baby is born, then as soon as they're outside of the womb, that's a very nice protective environment. But as soon as they're starting to breathe, and they're also being exposed on their skin, orally through food, and then they're breathing in lots of things which are potentially harmful. And so for some aspects, that's a kind of immune education. So we know that all of those exposures are actually teaching the immune system to then to do its primary job, which is to keeping us free from reacting badly to viruses and bacteria. But we know that exposure is really critical. So as Carsten mentioned, there's a lovely study where in the US where they compare Amish people with Hutterite people. So they're very, very similar genetically, but the only the difference is environmentally, where the Amish people, the mothers are in the cow sheds being exposed to the animals, even prenatally. Then during pregnancy, the babies are around the farmyard dust and bacteria. And whereas Hutterites, very similar genetically, but they have very modern mechanistic farming, so their children don't get the same exposure to the animals. And there's an incredibly low incidence of atopy and allergies and virtually no asthma in Amish children, whereas Hutterite children have the same risk risk and incidence of asthma as the rest of the US population. So we think we're trying to understand how those particular exposures very early in life actually educate the immune system. Because if we can deviate that and then teach the immune system that, yes, you should be tolerant to either these food allergens or these inhaled respiratory allergens, then we might be able to prevent having really severe allergic reactions later on.
And so thank you for that. And so do you think, Carsten, how much credence do you give to the hygiene hypothesis now? Is it that we're too clean and we need to be out in the cowsheds?
No, yeah. So the hygiene hypothesis came about because David Strachan, who is a just retired epidemiologist based in London at St. George's, observed this connection between having a higher number of siblings and a lower risk of hay fever and eczema. And he then proposed in this paper in 1989 that triggered such an avalanche of interesting research, both in a lab setting, immunology, but also epidemiology work and so on. He proposed it was the exposure to pathogens. It doesn't seem to be, as I said before, it's not one particular virus or one particular bacterium. And that's why we're now talking about the biodiversity hypothesis, and green space potentially comes into this as well. Conventional epidemiological studies have asked participants usually, do you live in a rural or do you live in an urban setting? Well, that's a very blunt way of looking at it. We now have satellite images that we can use and to tease out the amount of green space, and how that links in with the microbiome of the skin, the gut, the soil, the animals, everything that surrounds people in more detail. So I'm hoping that sort of more sophisticated epidemiological work might be able to give us some better answers.
And Alex, what about trying to prevent allergies to foods in particular by looking at what time you introduce babies to those foods? And so is the advice changing about when to feed babies, not peanuts, obviously, because they can choke on them, but peanuts, food, butter?
Yes, so this is something actually that Paul mentioned. So the LEAP study was a landmark study demonstrating that introducing peanut in the first year of life prevented development of peanut allergy by the age of 5 by 81%. So there was an 81% reduction in the prevalence of peanut allergy by introducing peanut in the first year of life, and this was in the form of bamba, snack, or peanut butter, so not the actual peanuts.
And
but it wasn't.
Had been told the opposite, hadn't they?
Yes, exactly. So yes, so in the early 2000s, the recommendations were actually to avoid peanut in pregnancy, lactation, and up to the age of 3. And then in about 2008, I think the American Academy of Pediatrics withdrew these recommendations and said, well, we don't have evidence for this, so do whatever you want, basically. There were no active recommendations to do either one thing or the other. But then once the LEAP study was out in 2015, actually the guidelines changed immediately in the US, and then after that in Europe and in Australia and Europe, and we are now introducing peanut and other allergenic foods like egg much earlier than we used to.
So do you think we'll see a big difference from that in the coming years, just as you saw a difference with parents, waiting?
So I think then in the real world, I think the scenario is much more complex. And Paul showed that the Australian study, which showed that, because in Australia, actually, they took up really very, very much this concept of introducing peanut early, because every society, I think, reacts to the evidence in a different way. So they were very open to this and very proactive introducing peanut. But then looking at the prevalence of peanut allergy, it hasn't really changed as much as expected. Now, I think in the real world, I think, things are more complex than in a highly funded clinical trial where there's a big research team very motivated to keep these patients adhering to the intervention and so on. So I think we need to look into the reasons for that, and there's a variety of reasons that we can think of. I mean, timing and dose being one of them, for example. But also just thinking about implementation of the findings of the LEAP study in the society. I think there's a big a lot of work to be done there. Changing practice, it's something that really takes time. So I don't think we can also assess the impact that soon after the study was produced, because people, despite the evidence and guidelines, do change time to change their practice. And there's also the influence of cultural background, extended family, things that are just what people are used to that will take time to change.
Yes, and I guess when the evidence has changed over time, then understandably people then take a long time. Other people may say, oh, but it was the opposite, and you shouldn't do that, and people may look at that instead. I guess it takes time for the science to get through.
Exactly, because here we are just recommending. I mean, it's within my career. I mean, I think it's something that we have changed. We used to say one thing, and now we do say the complete opposite. So I think it's understandable that people take time to adhere to that.
Yeah.
And I think what we're learning, and this doesn't surprise me at all, is that one size doesn't fit all. When you think about allergy, there's a really boring allergy. You've got peanut allergy. Come back next year so I can tell you the same thing again, and then come back the year after. That's not what gets us excited. What we're seeing now is, one size doesn't fit all. So we're seeing there are different responses to eating peanut early in certain children, but not in other children. In Australia, it didn't work in Australian origin children, but if you were Asian, or it did work in white Australian children quite well, but it didn't work in the Asian Australian population. So what's the influence there in terms of environment and genetics? We're seeing that in some other countries as well. And I think just a word of warning, I think the really crucial thing is if you start exposure to an allergen, don't stop it, carry it on. Those areas where we're seeing more of it's working is when you start the peanut, or you start the egg, or start whatever it is, and actually you do it on a regular basis. But people tend to sort of start and stop and start and stop. We'll do it once and then, I forgot, and it's busy. It's really busy bringing children up and feeding them. I know that. In fact, I think most people in this room know that. And for us, it's getting that balance right between how do we get a simple message out there that people can do, because we don't, I've had some families come to us, I'm sure you have as well, where they've got an Excel sheet and they've got a day, every single day they've documented the exact amount of food that they've given their child and so on, and they're literally running a computer program and a hospital at home. And that's not what we're trying to do here. It's got to fit in. If you live in Greece, for God's sake, don't start introducing peanut, because there's very little peanut allergy in Greece. And if all of a sudden everyone started feeding babies peanut, there'll be a lot more peanut in the environment. It would get in through the skin, and peanut would be go, woo! And so we've got to be really careful that the advice is appropriate for the setting and for the family, the cultural reasons like Alex said, and so on. It's not a one size fits all. And for me, that's what makes allergy interesting, keeps us interested as clinical academics, because it is so variable. There's so much in it.
Now let's look a bit at treatments before we take some more questions. So, Carsten, can we start with antihistamines? What are they doing?
Antihistamines stabilize the mast cells, so that's how they prevent the release of histamine. Mast cells are packed with little vesicles full of histamine.
And what about EpiPens?
Oh, that's one for
you?
Yeah, that makes me worried. I'm a dermatologist. I don't deal with anaphylaxis. So no, please, can I pass this on to you? Thank you.
With pleasure. So EpiPen is adrenaline. So it's the most effective treatment for allergic reactions, and it's recommended for anaphylaxis, so systemic allergic reactions. And it should be given in the muscle, so on the thigh, like this. And it acts on a variety of receptors. Called alpha and beta, and we have many in a lot of different organs and tissues. And essentially what it does, it's something our body produces in situations of stress. So essentially when we're treating anaphylaxis, we're just giving a little boost of something that we are already naturally producing. But then what it does is that it increases our heart rate, it makes our vessels go a bit narrower, so it boosts up our blood pressure, which is something that goes down in severe allergic reactions. It reduces the swelling, it dilates the bronchi, so the airways, making people be less wheezy and breathing better. So it's really the most effective treatment, and patients at risk of anaphylaxis should carry them with them at all times.
And after people have used an EpiPen, then the pens will say that you should then seek medical care. You should then go to hospital. Why is that, in case it happens again?
Yes, that's right. That's correct. So that's what we recommend to our patients. So even if they have recovered and they feel better, they should still seek medical help and make sure they are checked. There's a small proportion of patients that have what we call like a second wave of anaphylaxis, and this is very rare, but it does happen. I mean, the mechanisms for that are not entirely clear. It could be that the allergen is still in the body. It could be that there's just a late sort of phase of the allergic response, so there's other cells coming and reacting, but for that reason, they should be coming to the hospital to be checked, and also there should be a period of observation of about 6 hours, so that we can just monitor and make sure they're okay before they go home.
And we talked, Paul, about trying to prevent peanut allergies by feeding babies peanuts. But of course, the other thing that was done in the LEAP study was feeding tiny amounts to people who already had peanut allergies to get them used to, the children used to them. Presumably that is something you have to do with a doctor. You can't just do that yourself.
You shouldn't do it yourself. And that's quite important. So I guess we're now quite excited, those of us who work with food allergy, because before we've always said, don't eat peanut, come back next year. Here's an EpiPen or an adrenaline pen. That's not treatment. We're just managing risk. We're not treating. And as doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals or so, we like to treat. We can now desensitize in much the same way that Carsten now has treatments for eczema, injections, monoclonals. You touched on some of those. Same for asthma as well. We're beginning to get into that area for food allergy. But it's messy. It works. But one of the problems we have, and you know, we've been doing desensitization in my centre now for about 7-8 years, is that if you're allergic, you hate the taste of the food you're allergic to. It's a built-in protection system. I actually think it's due to an allergic response, because even when we've managed to treat people when their antibody levels have come down and we can look in their immune cells and the allergy has come down, we are still detecting antibody in the mouth and they still hate the taste. And our biggest challenge is to take teenagers, here, eat peanut, you've got to do it every single day for 3 years under medical supervision so that it doesn't kill you. And we know you hate the taste, and then after 3 years, yeah, well, you know, you'll be okay. Well, now what does okay mean? Because they're still allergic, it's just they need to have 50 peanuts to have an allergic reaction. Most of us still think they need their adrenaline pens, so that doesn't help them either. They hate the taste, and actually a huge number of them want to give up. I mean, I don't want to do sort of sponsorship or anything, but thank God for peanut coated or chocolate coated peanuts. I'm not going to give a particular brand away. I don't have shares in that company. I wish I'd bought shares in that company about 10 years ago before I started doing this, because almost all our peanut allergic children, we've got about 300 or so of them now who've gone through the treatment. They're all on peanut and mms, if I can say that, because it's a slightly less stronger taste. It's chocolate. It feels more natural. It doesn't feel like a medicine. You're eating fun food. And that's really the challenge, to make this normal. And I think a lot of people think it's the cure. It's a magic bullet, and it isn't. And furthermore, we've got to think, well, actually, what are they trying to achieve at the end of the day? And make sure we have that discussion with them at the start so that we don't set their expectations too high and then actually, no, we can't deliver on that.
Well, I'd like to take some more of your questions now. Do put a hand up. There's somebody over here, up there. If you could wave so she can see you, that would be great.
I just want to say, first of all, it's been a really interesting talk, so thank you. I've got 2 questions, hopefully they're straightforward. The first one is coming back more towards the first part. I know we talked about environmental factors. Is it the case that, like, if you're exposed to something that's more adverse for the body, like the pollutants in a high pollution area, your body is then adapted to deal with it generally long term throughout your life? And as vice versa, if there's someone who's brought up in a rural area, they're less prone to getting something like hay fever, but they're more prone to, you know, getting an adverse reaction to pollution. That's the first question. Second question is more about the treatment. Is there research being done more to look into microbiome of the gut, i.e., is there a possibility that probiotics can help actually relieve symptoms of dealing with that allergy?
Thanks for that.
Thank
So,
you.
Carsten, what about the does the body adapt question? If you've lived surrounded by, say, pollution, are you adapting to it?
Yeah, well, I don't think so. I mean, air pollution is a bad thing on so many levels at the various surfaces that our bodies are exposed to in the environment. So it's the skin, it's the respiratory tract, you know, the nasal cavity, and so on. And it seems that pollution damaging the barriers of the body that are there to protect ourselves from the outside world will make it more likely that you are overreacting. Probably there's some low-grade inflammation being caused. I'm just to a degree speculating, maybe some of the others would come into this as well, but that you are certainly from a cutaneous point of view, you're more likely then to have a damaged skin barrier, and the skin cells that are an army that's fast asleep. We have around 20 billion white cells in our skin. That's an army that's fast asleep. It's there to protect us from the outside world. The risk is that as one of the factors, air pollution will start waking up that army. The cells, are, some of them called dendritic cells, they have dendrites, they have little fingers that reach up to the top of the skin barrier, and they can recognize tree and grass pollen, and they are able to recognize food protein as well. And a really interesting story is around the role of the hair follicles here. And we think that probably massaging babies in early life, as you're massaging, you're opening up the hair follicles. And colleagues in Berlin we're working with as part of this European Trans Foods project have shown that tree and grass pollen can survive in hair follicles for up to a week. And that is probably where this crosstalk happens. The interaction between the skin immune system is like a little tunnel in a hair follicle going down into the skin, directly talking to those alarmed cells, alarmed, for instance, through the air pollution.
So is the massage good or bad?
No, the massage in general, it's lovely to massage babies, so I don't discourage anyone from doing that, but just be aware that we have got funding from the European Union to look at the potential risks that might come with that. And that is, if you are a parent and you haven't washed your hands before you start doing your daily baby massage, and you have small amounts of peanut protein stuck to your skin, you are massaging the peanut protein into the skin, and we think that the peanut protein actually gets into the hair follicle, remains there, and then starts talking to the skin immune cells. And if they're worked up already through something like eczema, that's when they are in an alarm state, and they're more likely to recognize then the peanut protein as a danger signal.
And Alex, what about the microbiome and the probiotics question? Is the microbiome a way to look?
Yeah, so we know that the microbiome is very important, and we know that, for example, the microbiome is crucial to sort of help modulate, to form the immune system around the gut, for example. And this has been an area of interest of many people. So there's ongoing studies in mouse models, in vitro, and in humans as well, to try to understand this better. But I think this is a very complex field. So there's loads of different bacteria in our gut. This is influenced by many factors like diet, like different types of environmental exposures. So I think the evidence, especially thinking about trials and evidence in humans, to give probiotics or prebiotics. So probiotics contain the bacteria, prebiotics contain sugars that feed the bacteria, so that can favor sort of certain types of bacteria over others, so they could favor beneficial bacteria over others, for example. So the evidence, in humans is not quite there. So what I usually tell parents who ask me, can I give probiotics to my baby? Or, if it's something safe for babies, by all means, do whatever you would like to, but it doesn't do harm. But there is, the evidence that it can actually prevent food allergy or treat or prevent other allergies or treat allergies is not quite there yet. I think it's definitely an area of great interest, and that we should research more.
Let's take a question from online as well, and then we'll come to just here. Zoltan, do you have anything nice?
Caught me with my trousers down, sorry.
Oh, that's fine. We'll have the question
yes,
first. Oh, okay.
I'm going to paraphrase this, because I
Okay.
did find this one quite interesting. So the questioner was asking, so if a allergy, let's say a food allergy, disrupts the microbiota in the gut, and we know the microbiota can influence things like inflammatory bowel disease, does that mean an allergy can also predispose to something like inflammatory bowel disease? So allergy causing autoimmune disease.
Yeah, Alex, yeah.
So I think we don't have evidence of the I'm not aware of evidence associating food allergy with inflammatory bowel disease directly. But gut inflammation can predispose to food allergy. So if there's gut inflammation, if there's a disruption of the epithelial barrier in the gut, so the sort of lining of the gut, then that can facilitate sensitization and allergy. And sometimes, anecdotally, we see patients that have had a bad gastroenteritis, and then they develop a food allergy, whether that's associated or not. It's difficult to know. But I think gut inflammation could predispose, and changes to the epithelial barrier in the gut, so the gut lining, could predispose as well to food allergy. But the link with autoimmunity is not quite there, I don't think.
And there's somebody in the second row just here.
Hello. Your hookworm story was fascinating, but just wondering around other infections and viral infections and the effects that they can have on allergies. For example, people with long COVID are reporting changes in their allergies. Do we know what's going on there?
Do any of you know the answer to that?
I can.
Be
Claire,
brave.
go on.
Be brave.
Well, not for long COVID, but I think that in children, then if you look at the epidemiological evidence, so children and young babies who have large numbers or numbers of viral infections tend to have an increased risk of developing asthma later, and certainly, a proportion of babies who have lots of viral infections actually wheeze with those infections, and then a proportion of those go on to get asthma, and so we're kind of looking at that to see. But in terms of COVID, then I'm not aware that there's direct evidence that actually shows that the increase in allergies has changed.
So just about a couple of anecdotal cases. I've been involved in managing some patients with long COVID, and some of our patients we've treated who've developed COVID. COVID seems to be very good at getting mast cells excited. We see the vaccines typically cause a lot of tolerable in most people skin symptoms for a day or two afterwards, sometimes longer. And there is some evidence that that's working by, getting mast cells excited, much along the lines that we've been talking about tonight. Similarly, a lot of our patients who have COVID have evidence of, again, mast cells being far more excitable. I'm not going to use the word mast cell activation because that opens up a whole can of worms. But certainly, these people seem to get wheels far more easily. But it's really hard to do that sort of research because it's such a sort of mixed group. And, we had the similar sort of thing with chronic fatigue syndrome, 10 years ago. And at least we've been able to, because of the whole COVID scenario, focus a bit better on understanding a little bit of what's going on or not. And certainly COVID does have effects on mast cells. Does that mean everyone who has long COVID has mast cells being very excitable? There are certainly lots of people who have long COVID who think they've got this entity called mast cell activation syndrome, but it's very poorly defined. And I think a lot of people who think they have that actually probably have other explanations for their symptoms.
Together with colleagues internationally, I ran a COVID registry for patients with eczema. And so there was a physician component and a patient component to it, physicians entering their data across the world and patients being able to enter their own data as well, just to understand how they're fared during a COVID episode. And certainly there was no evidence that people with eczema had worse COVID. The only people who had a higher risk of COVID complications, so intensive care admissions, ventilation, were people who were on immunosuppressive drugs. And only people who were on 2 immunosuppressive drugs, in particular people taking oral prednisolone, oral steroids, plus another immunosuppressive drug like cyclosporin, people might have heard about, or methotrexate. Everybody else was faring at the same sort of level that the normal population then getting COVID.
That's interesting. Yes, there's a questioner over here.
Yeah, hello there. I was brought up in the north of England, and I born in the 40s, brought up in the 50s, and we played out on the streets. We went to school. No children were taken from school if they had a runny nose or a cough or a sneeze. We shared our sandwiches and our fruit and our sweets with other kids. And nobody got a peanut allergy. My 8-year-old granddaughter has a peanut allergy. Should my son and his wife let my grandchild get down and get dirty?
Very good question there, Paul.
Yes, because children need to be children and need to enjoy themselves. I remember being on a very memorable panel about 8 years ago at the Royal Society for Public Health down the road. And it was a big argument about the hygiene hypothesis. Got to get rid of it. It's really harmful, really bad. And I was like, really? Is it? And they started talking about this thing called old friends. And it's a sort of, and I get it now, but I didn't get it at the time. Just shows how stupid I am. And it's sort of, people think when you say hygiene hypothesis, we've got to be super clean. If we are super clean, that is why we've got all these problems now with autoimmune disease and allergies. So actually, we're going to be super dirty. And sorry, that's probably not the right phrase to use in an organization, here in this building. And I think, what we're trying to do is actually, in terms of, what message should people take home with them. It's about old friends. So by living a different lifestyle, living more indoors, less outdoors, we are exposed to different bugs, different numbers of people, and so on. And that's what's changing our microbiome a lot. And we don't understand those changes, and we don't understand which changes are good and which changes are bad. Lots of the bugs that live inside us are very good, and we need those to help with our immune system. And we're only beginning to, I think, scrape the surface, understanding how bugs that sort of hook onto us actually help drive our immune system in a good way. And so really what we need is targeted hygiene, which is, be careful in terms of, don't eat sewage. And it's probably not good to swim in the Thames, unfortunately, although maybe things are going to get better over the time. But don't go overboard in terms of hygiene, either too much hygiene. And I am worried about everything you buy in the shops nowadays for cleaning contains added antibacterials. We don't really know that for years, centuries, millennia, we've managed without all this stuff, and simple soap is pretty good. And then at the same time, we've got people then go, well, too much hygiene is too much. So, we're going to get down and dirty. And again, we see other problems that come of that, including immune dysregulation and so on. It's getting a sensible balance. But we do have to get more people outside, more exposure, because we're getting fatter in pretty much most countries around the world. And this sort of indoor activity that we now have is just not helpful for allergy or for anything.
Some good tips there. Don't eat sewage. I remember that one. So to wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you, because it seems as though there is still, an enormous, that science is discovering loads very fast about this, but there is more to be done, of course, as well. Can I ask each of you what you think the future looks like for our understanding and treatment of allergies? Carsten.
Well, for me, the most exciting thing is being in that clinic that I was talking about, children, young adults who have very severe eczema, now being able to offer something that's different from immunosuppressive drugs, which are very blunt tools. But because we now understand what happens immunologically in the skin so much better, to be able to target those immunological pathways and really turn people's lives around. I mean, some of these drugs have really been life transforming. Most people think eczema is chronic and can't be cured. I would contest that. Not in everyone, but if you switch off that army that I was talking about, these millions of immune cells that have been worked up for years in these people for long enough, we are finding now that we're stopping the drugs after 2 or 3 years of being clear, almost clear. The eczema doesn't necessarily come back. They may have a little bit of dry skin left behind, and that's their genetic background of that skin barrier damage, but as long as they look after their skin well, they may well be okay. So that's the really exciting bit, and there's this huge pipeline of medications coming our way. And for me, the other main work stream we want to pursue is that mind and skin connection, really trying to understand how inflammation in the skin that causes itching and scratching, and through that, the sleep disruption from being a small baby for so many years. That's a form of torture, and may well be the explanation why so many of my adolescents with severe eczema have got anxiety and depression, and there's so much mental health issues in my cohort. I have a clinical psychologist like Alex has in her clinic working with me, and she's worked in multiple sclerosis, in many inflammatory conditions. She said she's never seen so much mental health issues. So trying to understand whether maybe the sleep disruption, skin barrier issues, links in with brain inflammation. And if we can find methods like neurofeedback, for instance, to treat the skin inflammation that way, rather than just suppressing the symptoms, would be something to aim for as well.
And Claire, what do you think the future looks like?
So similar to Carsten, so the biologics that we have, so these novel drugs which are really designed to sort of target the abnormal immune reaction. So they successfully block the kind of particular cells or proteins from this immune reaction. That they have been transformational for some patients with severe asthma, and they're available for adults and now for upwards of 12 years. But I think for going forward, I think having a greater understanding of the really early life immune system will allow us to try and target this so-called window of opportunity where the immune system is developing, and we want to set it on a healthy trajectory so that they won't have allergies. And so it's clear that we really need to understand what that healthy trajectory looks like, and then get those particular children onto that in the future.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, well, for me, I think, we are adopting new tests to support the diagnosis of allergic disease and make it much more precise and for the patients. And then also, I think, I hope that we will be understanding better the sort of immune response to food allergens, and soon we'll be able to use like biologics, like Carsten has been using for atopic eczema, also to treat food allergy, I think, and have a more sort of, treatment that is closer to the cure than what we currently have. What I appreciate and I really value currently in our way to manage food allergies is that we are much more proactive managing food allergies, and we are sort of supporting our patients to live with their food allergies and to live around the foods that they are allergic to, because foods is a normal part of life. Whereas before, I think we were very much like, we as a community, like avoid the food, be very careful, and I think this leads to anxiety and all sorts of issues. Food is part of life, and our patients should be able to live in a normal world. So I think, also being, all this awareness, I think hopefully we'll be able to understand better as well the links between anxiety and food allergy and support our patients better.
Thank you. And finally, Paul.
So for me, it's got to be what I'm researching, which is, can we spot which people are really in danger of having the worst type of reactions for food? When we see food allergic children and adults in clinic, we have no idea who's going to potentially have a proper life-threatening event. And so we give everyone adrenaline pens, which they then take home and put in their top right-hand drawer and never use. And so we throw them away, and we waste in this country about £10 million every single year in those adrenaline pens. If I could go, you're going to be fine. No, this patient, let me do this test. No, you're more risky. We need to handle you different. Instead of giving everyone 10 minutes of my time, I can give those people 10 minutes, and this person, I can give 3 hours over a 2-week period to make sure they really understand their food allergy properly. And I think we're going to get there. We need a bit more time. We need more research, more money, if anyone's in the audience. But I think we're going to be able to get better at delivering personalized medicine to patients with eczema, patients with asthma, patients with food allergies, better diagnoses. And I think life is going to get better, and we just need to get there.
Well, that's a lovely positive note to end on. And thank you to all four of you. And very good luck with your research in the future on this as well, because it seems to be making such a difference to people. We are out of time, but many thanks as well to all the people who've organised this event. There are lots of them: Anno Gara, Andreas Wack, Catano Racis Sousa, Crick Research, Rosie Waldron, Crick Public Engagement, Louise Howard and the team, Crick Events, Yvonne Borden, Zoltan February, who was giving us the questions there, Ursula Weiss and Nick Bernard, and Nature Research, of course, and Jenny Evans and Doug Brown from the British Society for Immunology. And thank you to Crick Nature Research and the British Society for Immunology for funding this. The Crick is evaluating this event and would love to know what you think to improve future events. So by email tomorrow, you'll get a short online survey. So if you do have time to take a few minutes to complete it, that would be very useful to them. Thank you to everyone watching elsewhere as well, and for your questions. And we hope you'll all return to enjoy other events and exhibitions at the Crick as well. And if you want to stay up to date with what's happening at the Crick, you can sign up to the mailing list. Many of you may already be on it, and you can do that on the survey or through the Crick website. Goodbye to everybody elsewhere. For those who are here, leaving is through the bottom sets of doors, but you're welcome to stay for the drinks reception next door to meet the panellists and ask them anything there that you want to ask them, and the organisers, and the building will close at 8:30 p.m. But thank you so much, everybody, for all your questions as well. Really interesting questions there. I'm Claudia Hammond. Bye-bye.